Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of the Art of Cybersecurity series with me, Chirag Joshi. I really like on this show that we discuss so many different aspects of cybersecurity, and law is so intricately linked with everything that happens in cybersecurity, and that's something that we need to always raise awareness on. Whenever I've been in executive tabletop exercises or I'm having conversations, having legal at the table is such an important aspect because ultimately, as I've said before, cybersecurity is there to enable the business and is a risk management exercise. And you cannot have good risk management if you don't consider all facets of risk, and a very closely linked risk to cybersecurity is legal. So on that topic, and also to get an international perspective, I am so delighted that on this episode, we are joined by Shruti Dvivedi Sodhi. Shruti is a very prominent lawyer in India, and I'm so grateful that she agreed to do this episode. She is currently a partner with Ketan Legal Associates, and she's had a long history in India of working with many different organizations in senior legal positions. She also mentors startups, which is a key part of giving back to the community, but also encouraging innovation in the next round of what we need to achieve in cybersecurity, especially in such a dynamic landscape. So with that, I formally welcome Shruti to the show. Welcome, Shruti, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much, Chirag. Yes, we've met very briefly once in India, but doesn't feel like that we haven't been rooted with a similar cause all along. And it's absolutely a pleasure to have this fun and a very, very dynamic conversation that I'm sure we are going to set up to be.
There we go. I love the word fun because these things should be fun, right? I always talk that cybersecurity is serious business, but it doesn't have to be serious all the time. We can have some humor and some fun while we're doing this serious work. So yes, absolutely. And when we met, that is where I remember we started chatting, and the first thing was like I need to talk to Shruti properly in terms of her thoughts and get it out because there is a lot of valuable insights that you can share with the audience. So Shruti, I gave a very brief snippet of your career, but would you like, in your own words, just talk a little bit about your career journey and what you've done and where your focus areas are?
So, Chirag, the way I like to look at my career journey, there are two fundamental things that I stand by, and perhaps, if I may take the liberty of saying that, has helped me in good stead. Always be keen to learn. Because, the minute you think that you know something, there's something else coming to disrupt it. You could have been a technology lawyer, and then suddenly there is a new devil on the block called AI and then generative AI. There, you could have looked at the legislations all your while, but suddenly you have the new data protection bit. I mean, I'm talking India perspective, and also a new Digital India Act that that remains to be seen as to what there can be there. So yeah, I mean, learning has helped me, and being keen to learn has helped me in good stead. And the other piece is being a lawyer and perhaps also a professional. It's all about communication. And communication is not so much about what I want to say, but who am I communicating to, and how and what will work for it to be communicated effectively to the person. And therefore, having started off in private practice with some of the leading law firms in India, and then moving in-house and doing general counsel accountabilities for legal and compliance, kind of really helped me evolve understanding the law and seeing how we want to use it for business. Because ultimately, at the end of the day, business has to happen. So it was those two phases of my life that kind of equipped me to come back to practice, and then see how do I kind of support and contribute to the newer dynamics of the business world, being startups and MSMEs. And that's what one has fun doing, and that's what I'm currently engaged with.
No, I allow those insights about the business has to happen and the desire to keep learning and growing, because that's the only thing that will keep us relevant and effective in our roles, especially as the world changes so quickly. The space of change keeps getting faster and faster. So it's definitely key. And being a startup founder myself, I do appreciate your work in that area, because I think no matter how experienced you are, no matter what your industry background is, when you are a startup founder, you need that guidance, and you always need people you can bounce ideas off with, people who can steer in the right direction. And I think it's really useful as we kind of evolve our ecosystems, as I was saying. So that's awesome. Thank you for that introduction. So if I get in some of the conversation areas, Shruti, one of the areas which I always think about the fact that India has more internet users than some countries have populations. That's how big the digital footprint and transformation in India is. So help our audience understand a little bit about the recent there's a lot of regulatory changes and legislative changes from what I'm understanding, and movement in that space. But when it comes to cybersecurity and data protection, what are some of the key insights that you can share? Because I'm sure all of these things are applicable, generally across our patches, but would be good to understand where you are with regards to that movement in India.
Clearly, currently, and as I say currently, I mean as on date, clearly what data protection and cybersecurity is governed by in India is largely the Information Technology Act of 2000, as an existing legislation, and the sensitive personal data rules that came out. So ID Act is of 2000, circa 2000, and then they did have an amendment in 2008 where sensitive personal data and responsible usage and safekeeping of personal data was brought into force. As we speak right now, we are perhaps going to be seeing some light to the day on the data protection legislation, because on 5th of July, the cabinet has already passed the bill, and it is up for discussion in this parliament session, which has begun as of yesterday, 20th of July. So we do hope to see some light to that legislation. And again, while the legislation may be coming now, I do feel the governance and the jurisprudence has already gotten established along the way, be it the Puttaswamy judgment on right to privacy, which made it a fundamental right, and then made right to be forgotten as part of that right to privacy. So some of those jurisprudence already exists. India being a hotbed for both Indian and foreign multinational. And when I say Indian and foreign multinationals, I mean Indian organizations doing businesses outside, and foreign multinationals, of course, who are keen to do business in India. Both have had to already comply with the already existing GDPR and the US data privacy legislations that exist. So the culture, the awareness, the culture, and the jurisprudence, perhaps to my mind, already exist. It's all about bringing it together and putting a compliance framework around it. Before I move further, I should also add that CERTAN, which is the nodal agency for cybersecurity and cybersecurity threats, it was formed way back as a nodal agency in 2013, but in 2022, it's brought forth a full, compliance requirement around reporting compliance requirements that, almost as quickly as 6 hours of you getting to know of a cyber threat or a cyber attack, you have to report it to the agency. And also demonstrably, what that means to say is that you should have the infrastructure in place to be able to, one, catch it, report it, and also to demonstrate to the agencies thereafter that, you were a prudent and you did take steps to have the infrastructure, both technical and legal, in place to be able to handle or address those issues. So perhaps a longer answer, but just to give you a flavor of a little bit of a personal view, and in that context, what exists.
Yeah. It's helpful. And just for our audience who might not know what jurisprudence means, can you just explain that simply?
Jurisprudence means basically judgments and case law that has come in within the framework of the of a country, where by establishing some either based on already existing law, what they need to convey or need to be interpreted as, and in the lack of a formal rule or law, something that will guide you towards understanding it and interpreting it in that way.
Got it.
So while, for example, while right to privacy got a fundamental right status through the Puttaswamy judgment, it now exists as my fundamental right. Whether I or not I have a full-fledged, full-blown, effective legislation that deals with my data and data rights, tomorrow if I feel my rights are being violated and I have a grievance, nothing can stop me from going to court and asking for my right and establishing it. So that's what I meant by jurisprudence.
No, I think that's important, and that is really helpful, right? Because right to be forgotten is a very it's a topic that is a big one in terms of how it can be achieved technically, and the possibilities, especially in this world we live in currently, with data everywhere. It used to be said that data has legs, and now I say data has wings. It's just really hard to contain. So it's a very interesting angle to it. The question I do have is, as you think about the new or proposed or in progress data protection legislation, and if you compare it to what India has had since 2000, what are like 2 or 3 key changes that you believe are going to be quite prominent if it does get through to the parliament?
More than anything else, there will be a structure and a framework to what qualifies as personal data. It will be far more nuanced. It will also be nuanced. What can that data be used for? And therefore, it will drive a compliance framework, which will now have consequences to it, penalties, for example. And also a whole full governance mechanism will come around it. And it will bring together both cyber and protection. So cyber security and data protection are 2 dimensions to the whole game. It will kind of bring together those 2 pieces and put together a governance board, which will then adjudicate or decide upon issues that are brought forth on that basis by anybody, by organization, more by individuals, because it's a right for an individual versus an organization, and the organizations will be answerable. So I think accountability coming through with that legislation is to me the key takeaway, that the data has to be used, personal data, and it has to be used responsibly. And if you do not use it responsibly, you are accountable to.
No, I think that's really good to know. And it's how the enforcement mechanism sounds like a fair bit of this, what you mentioned, Shruti, is now getting in the culture area, right? Like organizations culturally now need to think about cybersecurity data protections differently, more proactively. In terms of that culture side and the tone at the top, so from senior executives and the boards, what are your observations with regards to that happening currently? And how do you feel cybersecurity and legal can work together to influence that outcome?
It's a very, very good question, Chirag, because ultimately, I was at a very interesting group of very, very learned people and who were talking a lot of fun things, and I'm going to digress a bit to answer this question. We're talking about generative AI as such, and that whole discussion around regulation of how generative AI and how do you regulate AI actually, so to speak. And one of the fundamental things that came out of that conversation was that it's perhaps the only way to regulate it is to have responsible people, innovate it or work on it and bring it together, because ultimately it is so nimble, and it can create on its own, it can think on its own, it can design on its own. So therefore, unless we've given it the right framework to work inside of, how do you do that? And what is that right framework? It's nothing else but human value systems. Because, if you've given it that, then it has nowhere else to go to, because that's what it's creating within. And, so clearly, so why did I say that? Is because, you raised this pertinent point of culture. And so it has to be, this is so much more, I would say, both the technical aspects, having the technology framework and the cybersecurity framework at one end, and the policies and the documentation, etc., at the other end of the spectrum, together has to be with the way I think about this. As a founder, when I say I mean any founder, promoter, shareholder, that community has to be invested in that, and therefore culture clearly starts from the top, right? So it's like your children are who you make them. So the source has to kind of play a bigger role in that space, and therefore senior leadership boards have to first and foremost, I do feel as we grow older, we are extremely resistant to change. And therefore, technology, the only way to deal with technology is to know that, it's here today and it's going to evolve the next second. So therefore, I think the mindsets of, oh, okay, I did this yesterday, why do I need to look at it today, will have to alter. And in that context, understand your own organization's dependence on these frameworks of cybersecurity and data protection. How much reliant are you on? One is to set up the information technology and infrastructure and frameworks for the businesses you do to enable that. And if you are data dependent, which I believe every industry now is data dependent, including the analytics around it, then you have to also assess both the impact and what will it take to kind of be able to responsibly manage that impact, and therefore invest. So, without just having the culture will not work, or good thinking will not work if you've not in reality assessed. One, in terms of investments for what will it take for you to have a robust cybersecurity framework for an organization. And then with those two behind you, the board will also need to be very keenly involved with initiative and implementation. Because, that's when you will really break it down into awareness and training at one end of the spectrum to policy and culture. And culture will flow through from top to bottom. It will actually have to be seamless. And then all your commercial and business engagements. So it needs an absolute sponsorship. It exists, but I think it's limited by the awareness that everybody has. And perhaps the new legislation will bring in more attention and therefore more awareness around that.
Nice. And that's, yeah, very well said. And I think there are lots of good, valuable insights there. One I really was stuck out to me, the human value system with AI. I think that's a really fundamental point, because, I think that's important for us to, get that get that across the line, because if we don't, it's a risk that we run, right? Because I think being kind, it's really important, and I think kindness, empathy, how to put that in the value system, I think that's the key. Also think from your vantage point, the change resistance aspect of cybersecurity is really key, right? So I want to get your thoughts on, in India. So I'll just, let me tell you about what's happening. What I've seen noticeably happen in Australia from my perspective is, since a few regulatory changes happened, notably in Australia, there was, APRA CPS 234, which is around financial institutions and financial services. That legislation, in a way, set the tone with regards to, it's more of a regulatory requirement more than a legislation, but the regulatory requirement was around the responsibility ultimately resides with the board and the executives. So I think it sorted that out. So that in itself enforced that culture change. While we always knew it was the right thing to do, and a lot of frameworks and a lot of industry leading practices recommended for that, when you started this expectation being set very clearly to meet compliance requirements and regulatory requirements, I think that changed the game. And it's been for the better, because you're starting to have these engaged conversations now where you're no longer going around and saying cybersecurity is important. I think now it's actually the opposite. There's a lot of demand coming from the top to know more about it, to actually get better data, better quality information. So that's changed the culture in many ways. Lots of work to be done, obviously, but it's a good start. In India, do you see that momentum changing of that, that tone at the top yet?
So yes, Chirag, and I think it will get a little more wins to it with the new requirements that will come in, because there's a consequence attached to it, and part of the threats that you have that are now increasingly becoming more and more real and more innovative, like we spoke. There is no other way to look at it more as being aware of the risks now. And I think business risks have consequences, and business risks have to be accountable for. And therefore, to your point, with consequences like that, if heads need to roll, sorry to say that very badly, so then if an accountability needs to be set, then consequences will start to begin to be taken more cognizance of.
Yeah,
it's going to get there increasingly. It's not that it's not there, but it is going to get there increasingly.
Yeah, it's quite interesting, right, Shruti? Obviously you don't want that to be the change driver by itself, because I feel like the positive change driver is always better when you understand the true relationship on how, security can actually help you move faster. Similar to how, always say, invention of brakes or having brakes did not slow down cars. They actually allowed it to go faster because you have control over what you can do. And I think with security too, if you think of it as an enabler, it's actually powerful. But I do understand that businesses don't think, like, nobody starts a business to do security unless you're in security business, right? You start to deliver products, services. I mean, that's the idea. You are in there for a specific purpose, and security is just one thing there as part of an overall, CEO's vision or CEO's priorities. But I think having that embedded in enterprise risk taxonomy, having education around why that's important and giving that its due attention, I think that to me is a good way to do it. But in absence of that, or in, I won't say in absence, but in lack of priority for that, having legislations that enforce that and reinforce that, I think that's just powerful, because it does bring that to attention sometimes. And sadly, sometimes that's what you need. It's better off having that as opposed to dealing with a major incident that you are heavily impacted and then paying attention to cyber.
Absolutely. And I think, ironically, that's human nature. You only look at things when they are beginning to have more real consequences for you, versus well, it's going. And overuse, stroke abuse has a thin line. And therefore, by design, we are We are equipped to do it both in the good ways and in the wrong ways. We will we will push the envelope till as much as we think we can, and stress test the limits. Now, it's a good thing in good areas where we need to kind of give ourselves stretch targets. But sometimes when we do it with things which can make it be irresponsibly used, then obviously we pay the price for it.
And that's where, in my books too, I've always, and whenever I speak and present, always emphasize that we should not rely solely on this fear factor, because that doesn't last. Fear does not drive lasting change. It may get your attention, it may get some temporary changes, but real lasting change comes when you actually, embed that as part of your DNA, you embed that as part of your culture, you have positive, reinforcements, right? So I think that's hopefully the direction. So changing tact a little bit there, Shruti. Now, I think it's connected in the sense that we talked about, the potential impacts of incidents or bad things. One of the ways where organizations, have tried to mitigate or address that is cyber insurance, right? I think cyber insurance has become increasingly prominent and it features heavily everywhere. I have my views on cyber insurance. I think it's exactly what it is. It's an insurance. It cannot be your only control. But I also want to get your perspective, because what you see in the market is quite interesting. The premiums keep going up, by the way, and having a good risk program actually helps you a little bit there. But sometimes, you got to really ask yourself that hard question on, is it worth it? So I want to get your thoughts, because I know you deal with cyber insurance a fair bit and you come across that. How do you view its role, and what are your advice on getting it right?
So, if you look at any business, Chirag, businesses at one end all about taking risks, calculated risks, and seeing because without that there is no growth and expansion in a business. That's the fundamental theme that I hear from all businesses as such. And therefore, the flip side of that is risk mitigation. Because ultimately, while you will take risks, but how are you mitigating the ones that you're exposed to? And if you cannot, and one of the aspects of risk mitigation is insurance. And therefore, and as insurance lawyers, in fact, we are one of the leading lawyers for insurance in the country. And we do look at the entire ecosystem. So when I say the ecosystem is like working with organizations as assureds in assessing, doing a gap analysis and assessing the exposures, and also recommending what insurance covers there could be for them to consider for the risks that they have, to working with insurance companies and figuring out new products, and at the other end of the spectrum to be looking at claims resolutions, so to speak, from an assurance perspective. So that makes us extremely aware of the whole 9 yards of how this needs to go. And if I were to just be a true blue lawyer, and I could just go ahead and just say, with data protection coming in, and as law, cyber insurance is your only answer to quantifiably risk mitigate. And while that may remain as my answer, but I will say this to add on or to put value to that answer. So to your point, yes, cyber insurance is not the only way to risk mitigate. First and foremost, you have to see what infrastructure you have in place, the entire technology framework, the cybersecurity, aspects. How have you stress tested it for cybersecurity? Because even an insurer will only give you an insurance cover if you have a robust system. So and then obviously, how have you put in your policy and culture and training and awareness? How there shouldn't be any abuse of just because you have a framework, you don't need to pay care. That doesn't work. And therefore, the third guardrail in the system is insurance. So, and why is insurance necessary is to see it's increasingly actually more than cyber insurance. It's also looking at D&O, because it also brings in the directors and officers liability perspective that we spoke of. And cyber insurance covers are necessary for the simple reason that you should be looking at what really are your risks, and are they actually getting covered by insurance covers, so to speak. So without confusing it too much, and to kind of summarize the thought that I'm trying to build here, you need to have you cannot ignore cybersecurity and the cybersecurity framework. That is your first port of demonstrating your intent to be a safe and a secure organization that people should do business with. Secondly, you need to have your documentation, your policy frameworks in place to be able to demonstrate your intent, and also communicate that from a de-risking perspective, both to your vendors and also customers, that that's the framework you work in, and also drive that culture internally with the policy framework. And then the third, like I said, it's not just becoming popular to take a cover and perhaps the premiums are rising and not being well negotiated because we are not assessing and pinpointing the risks that we are thinking of, and the way policies are being written. So just some awareness of through your risk analysis, gap analysis, is that experts like you in the cyberspace and and legal people like us in the legal space can perhaps collaborate and put together. And on that basis, the insurance law team in the organization, say for example, they take a keen look on both the policy wording and how is it actually going to cover, because ultimately policies can get written, but when rubber hits the road, when you actually have to have a claim under the policy, does your policy really cover it or not, becomes the litmus test of the cyber insurance policy. And that to your question on premiums rising can also be an answer, because you don't need a broad cover and you could do with a lesser premium if that's you identify a specific piece as your risk versus the whole 9 yards.
No.
So I'm not sure if I've confused you with my answer or if I have kind of picked up pieces.
Pieces. I am not. No, it's not confusing at all. I think it's important because it's a lot, and I like the fact that you approached it the way you did, because it's not a simple topic, right? Sometimes people want to should I get insurance? How much should I be insured? It's really depends on so many aspects. And I really like the fact that you articulate that as your insurance should cover your business risks. And that's the key bit here, is you need to understand the business that you are in, and as a cyber professional, cyber practitioner, quantify as much as possible, or at least have a risk assignment to your thinking and to your critical business processes. Because if you don't do that, conversations like insurance, the right threshold, the right frameworks that you need to put in become really hard. And you then run the risk of spending too much money and getting very little in the ways of actual protection. And there are obviously cases where you find out where sometimes people thought that they had insurance for certain things and realized when an actual incident happened that they really weren't covered because they never really bothered to test it or assess it and analyze it. So I think to me that's really important, is you start with your business, start with your key risks, start with your key controls and your frameworks, and then figure out where insurance can help you and to what extent are you exposed and what extent can you create your own contingencies internally that you can ring fence perhaps, that can come in handy. So, it's kind of a form of self-insurance in a way, right? But all of those things can be an answer. There is no right or wrong answer here. So it's really good perspective there. On this one, right? So while I'm moving away from insurance, there is one area which I do want to talk when it comes to incident response and incidents is ransomware. Now, ransomware is a global problem. It's affecting countries everywhere, organizations everywhere, industries everywhere. And it's a very profitable model for cyber criminals, right? That's why it exists. It's very profitable. From your perspective, ransomware positions for organizations are very hard to make, and every country has a different way on dealing with it. There are many laws involved. It's a complex issue. In your view, what would your advice be regarding paying ransomware? Would that something that under what circumstances that should be considered or could be considered? And where do you think is pretty black and white and it shouldn't be a conversation? What are your thoughts on ransomware payments?
So I think I will go to incident response, which you briefly touched upon as a segue into this question. Clearly, incident response can really limit the impact. And for organizations to have a response system, incident response system, be aware. So supposing I am working for an organization and I, suspect some things are amiss with my personal device. Who is it that I need to go to? And I'm perhaps lower in the value chain, supposedly in the, an organization. Now, data protection officers will come into play, etc., etc. But organizations that don't have that, what could be their go-to person, and what is that person's reaction or response protocol? That needs to be written out very, very carefully with organizations, and that, because I'm a firm believer, the more impact you limit, the more you equip yourself with a negotiation position in ransomware attacks. So, for example, like you said. And ransomware, I think, Chirag, unfortunately, there are no straight answers to this one, because strategically it will depend on what's at stake, obviously. The threat to life and liberty, and some of those more fundamental aspects as to, should you kind of succumb to a ransomware attack demand or not? So, and hackers are 20 times more intelligent than us, the cyber criminals. So they obviously know where to use a ransomware attack versus, so they've obviously picked up a sensitive topic for a nation or for an organization, so to speak. And depending on the threat, an organization, as I'm speaking, I'm drawn to an analogy of a plane hijack. And that, it's actually just, on ground and new ways of war and terrorism, it perhaps is quite similar to that. And therefore, in an ideal scenario, yes, we should not fuel the fancies of a ransomware cyber criminal. But philosophically, that would be the right answer. But really, what's at stake? If life and liberty at stake, perhaps not. If some very strategic security information is at stake, I mean, and those are the issues where decision makers may lean towards one way or the other. And that risk evaluation actually is incident and actually, I won't even call it risk, threat specific, because this it's more palpable in those occasions. So
no, you're right. it's not a straightforward thing, and that's why it's such a tricky legal, like what I understand is a legal area too, where you may not be, depending on a country's regulation legislations, it might run afoul of that. But it's such an important point, right? Like, and we talk about ransomware a fair bit, but also think the protection and the controls, that's where the strength lies, is actually, there are certain controls if you get right, and always keep saying, like, you get your access right, you get your network security, but your backups, your recovery processes, if you tested them, if they adequately separated and secure them, you will hopefully not be in this position that you have to consider paying. And the challenge is for smaller organizations, because some of them, it's essentially, if they get locked out, that's their business right there. So it's tricky and it's hard, and which is where the more awareness we can create, the more urgency we can create on this topic, the better it is. So I'm glad
No,
to get.
absolutely, and that's where it is needed, Chirag, because technically, if you look at it, depending on the decision, we can give a legal justification for why it should be paid, and a legal justification for why it should not be paid. So, but decisioning is key, and the decisioning is always made on the threat that you are actually, and like you said, smaller organizations really get it at both ends of the stick, because they are between the devil and the deep blue sea.
Yeah,
some of those things.
And I think that's where helping them is a key part of where the focus needs to be. But it's also
Absolutely.
for small and medium businesses to understand. I think more and more now get it. They are at least increasing. But for a while, there was a sentiment, and I'm talking a few years back, where they're like, oh, why would they care about me? They'll care about the big guys. It's actually, no, they'll go where the money is, and they'll go where the weak spots are. So we just got to be vigilant across the patch.
The smaller, easy money is way better than difficult, big money.
Exactly. And the supply chains have now made it so much more complex, right? Like the bigger providers rely on smaller organizations as part of the supply chain. And that's where a lot of attacks actually start, is through the supply chain. So I think securing the whole ecosystem is the key, and every player has a role to play. You've been very generous with your time, Shruti. So I'll maybe have one more question and we can start wrapping up. And this is a question which I'm keen to get your thoughts on, and this relates to your work with Startup India and helping the startup ecosystem. What advice and what recommendations would you give to startup founders or startups who are now scaling up in terms of thinking about legal, thinking about cybersecurity, or thinking just being smart about how they approach things? What advice and mentorship can you provide them?
So, Chirag, if you look at the startup ecosystem in India particularly, they're either tech/deep tech startups, and there is a key technical distinction between tech and deep tech. But even others are largely tech enabled. So there is a huge tech relevance and a tech game in the startup ecosystem. Now, if tech enables and facilitates your business, it also exposes you to the vagaries of that world. And therefore, as young organizations, and I'm clubbing both tech and tech compliance and legal compliance, what I usually advise younger organizations or organizations that don't worry so much about cost of compliance, and don't think that you're a young organization and you will think you should scale up to a next level before you think about compliance. If you build it into your DNA, then your vulnerabilities, both at the tech side, which is cybersecurity, and your vulnerabilities at the compliance side, that you will start paying heed to when you are looking at institutional investors, will not be required, because you would have actually built your organizations. And not only scaling up will not be an issue, attracting good institutional investors will not be an issue, and therefore doing business will not be an issue. But for you to think of one fine day to look at what these issues are and how you want to address them, may not be the best strategy from creating a compliant framework for your organizations. And with ESG as environmental, social, and governance becoming a key area of corporate governance and conversation at boards, and a key requirement for organizations to demonstrate their capabilities on, it's only wise to start right rather than think about it as a patchwork once you are a particular stage, which you think is big enough to now focus or pay attention to such things. So that's been my advice. That I work with a lot of startups and PE and VC early stage funds, and that's what I say to them as well as organizations.
It's great advice, absolutely great advice. And I think compliance, legal, cyber, I think you got to think it's better if you think of them up front, right? I know that's not where your focus would be initially because you're trying to build a product, a service, get the speed. There's so much you grapple with, but knowing that this will come back to, hurt you if you don't think about this early on. It'll be more expensive, potentially stop you from getting into, new markets, or some organizations will not even work with you if your product's not secure. I think if you see that and you get advice like you're giving them and they take that seriously, it'll help them a lot in terms of, their success story. So really good points there. And last question, Shruti, we've talked about, your advice to others, but in terms of your own growth mindset, and what has allowed you, obviously, through the years to, operate at a high level, and now, being a partner with a law firm, how do you drive your own growth mindset, and what allows you to stay up to date with everything that's happening?
See, the intent, like I said, when I started off, was forgetting my age a lot of times and saying that I'm still keen to learn and keeping reiterating it for my own self. And then seeing in the new age as to what can I do to upskill. And upskill could be through programs, conversations with like-minded people like you, Chirag, and know a little more about cybersecurity and, what else can we do to staying abreast with the next generation, basically because, I'm one of the oldest members of the team, perhaps, from the perspective of age. So there's so much more to learn from new startup founders at one end who are solving for or creating new things, and the young team that I work with at the firm. And each one brings forth a new perspective, new dimension, and also a new interpretation to what we are discussing or evaluating. So yeah, I mean, just the day when my red flag will be the day I feel that this is too tough to learn or understand. I mean, I may not become an expert at it, but at least I should be aware. So my litmus test will be, seeing myself every day. Am I resisting change, or am I actually wanting to kind of at least understand it to the extent that I need to understand it? Now, I'm not going to become an expert in every field, but at least I should be aware that this is what, say, for example, Gen AI is capable of doing. So what is it? How does it happen is not what is relevant, but that it is possible and I better be aware of it is something that that I should be mindful of and keep looking at.
No, it's really good. I think that aspect of the curiosity that you're describing of things is so powerful. And also the fact that I really like that, age, putting that aside, I mean, it's just the fact that you are willing to learn from anyone and everyone, because I too completely subscribe to what you just said is everyone can teach you something if you're paying attention to that. The day you really, when you stop growing is the day when you exactly said right, is when you think there is nothing more to learn, or, things become too hard and you think that your way is the right way. That's when you're on the wrong track. And I think as long as, and really in this, like, just in last 3 years, 2 years, generative AI became a thing, right? Like it became commonplace. It wasn't so much. So AI has been around a while, ML has been around a while, but just the consumer aspect of it, just the impact of it, last 2 years has been far more noticeable. And you were exactly right, being aware of what it means, but also like you were thinking, and the conversation you said about earlier in this chat with the human value system applied there. I mean, that's the right way, because you have these experience and years of experience now that you can apply to what may be new things, but I mean they're still solving some old problems. So it's always that area where if you're curious and if you're learning, that feeds the growth mindset. So again, Shruti, thank you so much for the time that you given us today. This conversation was invaluable. I always say when I have really good conversations is I don't think that this is the end of the chat. We'll have a part 2 and a part 3. I think it's always important. Things change, but having this initial conversation, and I'm sure with audiences here in Australia and even in India, it's good for them to listen to the perspective as well of what's happening, because like I said, the world's getting smaller, and what's happening in one country has an implication, especially country of size of India.
Got it. No, thank you so much, Chirag. It's been a great conversation, and yes, I look forward to part 2 and 3, because this is the conversation of today, and this is the conversation that's relevant. And the more we speak about it, the more we are driving the culture and awareness that we are speaking about, and that's the only way.
100%. No, thank you, Shruti, and thank you very much to our audience for tuning in. See you next time. Thank you very much.